Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to be taking on a very complex and nuanced topic with regards to vaccination and the influenza pandemic. It's very important that if you are listening to this, that you don't jump to any conclusions, but you listen to what I'm talking about with regards to the science. I will explain why it is that I think that the lessons from the influenza pandemic in 2018 is relevant to today with regards to what we have done in the COVID pandemic. It is not in any way a criticism of vaccination in general. And for anyone who has been following my research, I have been focused on spike protein autoimmune responses since 2020. So everything that I talk about is within that paradigm. However, I do also believe that every single intervention in medicine does have some degree of risk, some more than others. And therefore, it requires a nuanced discussion, thoughtful discussion to ensure that every intervention is appropriate for the person that it is being given to. It's not always easy to do, but an important part of the science. So let's take on this topic, very complex topic, and you'll have to work with me as I step around carefully all of the issues that are in this. I've thought about this topic for easily over a year. I've never spoken about it because I figured that this is one of those touchy subjects that really need some thought. Just as a reminder before I start, if you are interested in understanding the COVID heart storm, scars on the heart, please look in the description and take a look at the course that is available. So let's get back to exactly what we're talking about here. I've got a few pieces of the puzzle. This was taken from the US National Library of Medicine. We're talking about influenza and masking up with regards to that. Just as an important point when we talk about masks, just remember that most viral transmission is by aerosol particles. And so, therefore, anything that reduces the amount of particles that gets onto another person could, in theory, reduce their risk of infection. So, let's always remain scientific about what it is that's happening. So, in those days, they were still talking about masks. And that made sense because it is aerosol particles. Not as easy with Omicron, but it's still relevant because many people have multiple infections. And you can see here that it was highlighting a few points that the Spanish flu was deadlier than World War One. It killed at least 50 million people around the world, second deadliest plague in history. So this is quite significant. And it started around the time when there was a war going on, and many of the politicians didn't want to address the issue because they didn't want the opposite side to think their troops were weaker. It's important that, again, so that those who are watching from the perspective of censorship, I will show you this is what was put in a Reuters article in 2021. And this was highlighting that a meningitis vaccine trial in a US military camp did not cause the 1918 Spanish flu. And this was clearly because there was a campaign going around regarding the COVID vaccines. And so they were challenging that these vaccines were not related to the influenza pandemic. I understand what they were saying and I understand why they were saying it, but it's not actually that correct. And you'll understand why I say that in terms of what exactly happened. And again, this is about understanding the science and applying what we have learned in the past to what comes in the future. So, there is an important thing that needs to be understood about what happened in 1918 around the influenza pandemic. And it was a gap in the scientific knowledge. Okay. And this is where I am highlighting what I think is the important point. And there's a paper here that looks at the state of science, microbiology, and vaccines around 1918. This was done in 2010. And they were looking at the influenza pandemic at that time and what was known and what wasn't known. And it's important that this very important line in the synopsis, Richard Pfeiffer announced in 1892 and 1893 that he had discovered influenza's cause. Okay, very important. What he found is Pfeiffer's bacillus or Bacillus influenza or H influenza, H flu. That's why we call it Haemophilus influenza. Was a major focus of attention and some controversy between 1892 and 1920. And so, what you have to understand is that at that time, there was a problem with the science because they did not know that viruses existed. Everything was about bacteria. And so when they thought that this bacteria was the cause of influenza, it made them targeted. Okay. So this is what then happened. So suddenly, not just him, but multiple other people started vaccine trials looking at bacterial products to treat or protect against influenza. So I'll repeat it again. At that time, they didn't understand about viruses. And so they thought that Haemophilus influenza, a bacteria, was the cause of influenza. And it was because they were finding that this was growing in the lungs of people who had died of influenza. So it made sense. This must be the cause. They didn't know about a viral infection with secondary bacterial infection. And so, what then happened is that they started to develop vaccines to try and prepare the population for influenza. And what they were giving them were tinctures or mixes or concoctions of bacterial products to prepare them for in case they faced the influenza virus. Okay. It sounds strange at this point because you know about viruses. Granted, there are some people who still don't believe viruses exist, but that's a different conversation. But for the time being, just imagine you didn't know about viruses, and the only thing that you thought was that by giving a vaccine, looking at preparing the body for a bacterial infection was the solution. And there was, as it says here, is there was a rudimentary state of scientific knowledge of influenza in the early 1890s. And so this was part of the problem. It was a specific communicable disease. It spread very rapidly and it produced explosive outbreaks. And they didn't know this was a virus. So that's the first part of the question. Why am I connecting this in relation to COVID? All right. Now, again, you have to walk with me and you'll understand why I'm making this particular association. So let's go again now. So remember, I said at that time they had limited understanding about viruses, if any at all. They perceived that influenza was because of a bacteria. And so, therefore, they developed vaccines to treat the bacteria without understanding the virus. And that was the problem at that time. So, let's jump to today and follow carefully here. This is COVID, the virus. And it's showing you here the characteristics of it in terms of the surface of the virus. The blue part is a spike protein. They're about 25 to 30, I guess, on each viral particle. In red here is the membrane protein, and orange is the envelope protein. And you can see inside is the nucleocapsid protein. And what has been done is that they have taken the spike protein, the most immunogenic part of the virus, and they have made vaccines to target it. And the premise was that if you trigger the immune system to target this part of the virus, you should be able to control the infection. That's the theory. Okay. I suspect they didn't understand about spike protein autoimmunity, which is what I've been focused on. That spike protein binds to numerous other proteins, ACE2, neuropilin 1, CD147, heparan sulfate. So if you don't understand spike protein autoimmunity, that logic would make perfect sense. If, however, you realize that, oops, this virus is triggering a cytokine storm, an immune overactivity, it should make you stop and question why. And that's where I was, is that I said, hold on, you don't fully understand the disease. What are you doing? Now, it's very important for me to say I have not stopped researching even severe COVID because, in my view, it's unacceptable to not fully understand the disease. How can you be talking about therapies and being so sure if you don't even know what the mechanism of severe disease is? If you don't understand fully the cytokine storm, why some people didn't get it, why others did, or why, specific children had patterns that were different from severe COVID in older people. All of these questions need to be fully understood, sharpening that axe so that you understand what you're doing. And so, within that context, this is why I have likened it to what happened in 1918. So, what they did then, remember, the link then is that they didn't know about viruses. And you can forgive them for that because they just didn't know it existed. And so, therefore, what they were technically doing is that they were taking bacteria, and this is a gram negative bacteria. And so it has in it some very specific characteristics, this lipopolysaccharide. This thing here is a beast when it comes to these kind of infections. And it drives much of the symptoms, the severe symptoms, when we have gram negative bacterial sepsis, because these lipopolysaccharides trigger an overreaction of the immune system. So much so that the body doesn't try and remember it. It's important to remember. Let me repeat. This lipopolysaccharide, if your body faces it with gram negative sepsis, it doesn't have a memory of it afterwards. It shuts it down because it recognizes that it can overreact if facing it again. And what is very interesting is that the other thing that it does a very similar thing to is with regards to the spike protein. It's very strange that when you look at this study, and this was looking at SARS-CoV-2 specific plasma cells are not durably established in the bone marrow. In effect, when they looked at long-term cells in the bone marrow, the immune system after 2.5 months, this is here, doesn't have any long-term cells. After 14 months, doesn't have any long-term cells. After 23 months, a dot of long-term cells. The immune system does not want to remember the spike protein. Very similar to what happens with the bacterial lipopolysaccharides. So here is the analogy. What we had was that in 1918, almost, I think, 80% of the military were injected with bacterial products, which would include priming their immune system to lipopolysaccharides. What then happens is that the flu, the influenza pandemic, then continues to spread. And guess what happens? The influenza virus triggers an immune response in the lungs because it's an infection with secondary bacterial infection. And guess what? The most common secondary bacterial infection is Haemophilus influenza, around influenza. The immune system being already primed to the endotoxins overreacts to the bacteria and destroys the lungs. And that's largely what they think. It was a hyperactive cytokine mechanism that caused most of the deaths, it seems, in the context of the influenza pandemic, because young people were dying. It was very unusual. Young people normally tolerate influenza the best. Old people usually die from influenza. So this was a flip around. And one has to ask if that many people had been exposed to the bacterial endotoxin by inappropriate use of a vaccine at that time, did it contribute to the cytokine storm? We then have the same question. As I told you, the immune system seems to be treating the spike protein in the same way that it treats bacterial endotoxins. It doesn't want to remember it. Just remember, long-lived plasma cells here. This is comparing flu to tetanus to spike protein, nothing after 2.5 months, nothing after 14 months, a dot after 23 months. The immune system doesn't want to remember this. And so, therefore, what it could indicate is that it's treating it more like a toxin, similar to what happens with the bacterial endotoxins. This is now where, Houston, we have a problem. Because if this extrapolation is correct, if the immune system has been primed to overreact on further exposure to spike protein, what happens down the line? The virus is still circulating. What does it mean when immune primed systems get exposed over and over again to the spike protein? That is where I think we are now. I hope I am wrong on this one. But if the preparation or if the approach in 1918 of overpriming the immune system, which then overreacted on exposure to the bacteria, could or would be replicated in our current situation where overactivity of an immune spike system, prime system, overreacts on exposure to infection. People may say, well, if that was the case, why has it not happened already? I suspect there are two reasons. One is IgG4, the immune tolerant antibody that is being triggered, especially by mRNA vaccines. And that's probably making an impact with regards to the presentation of this. The second thing is the variant. When we get a variant that triggers a response, more like what happened with the Delta variant, we have a problem. We keep hoping that everything will just go away. It doesn't look as though it will, and we have many challenges still ahead of us. But when we talk about the use of any intervention, whether or not it's a vaccine, an antibiotic, whether it's even immune suppression, we always have to think very carefully as to who we're giving it to and why. Is it most appropriate? That question was not properly asked in the pandemic. And frankly, there still has not been enough research to understand whether or not the right thing was done for a vast proportion of people. Remember, if you have listened to me, I have never said it shouldn't be used. But at the time in 2021, I always said confine it to your high risk cohort who had not previously been infected. For me, that was logical. I couldn't understand when it became spread throughout the whole population and then mandated. That to me is an error that must be acknowledged, even though it is inconvenient. It's my view, but let's see whether or not my concerns hold up over the long term. Thank you.